Happy Tuesday morning, everybody. It's a little bit warmer this week than it was this time a week ago. It's going up into the 70s here in Alabama. It's starting to feel like spring. Dare we hope that we're finally coming out of the winter here. I am joined by a couple of guys who, frankly, we're all looking forward to a busier spring. We're all looking forward to a time where we've got lots of stuff to cover and talk about. It's been a little bit of a slow week news-wise, but that gives us a chance to kind of step back and take a look at some of the bigger stories around the SEC. And I'm joined, as always, by Matt Zenitz on my right here, John Talty on the bottom of your screen here. Two of the best reporters covering the SEC today, two of the best sourced, the best writers, the best. They're pretty good guys too. They're despite their occasionally iffy tastes in movies. They're overall good guys. But guys, there's
appreciate that.
What'd you say, Matt?
I said I appreciate that. I didn't know you felt that way. I know John, so
I don't mind my Tuesday mornings hanging out with these two gentlemen. But there's a couple of additions as I add two great members to the show here this morning. There's a couple of additions that the Auburn Tigers have made to their roster that they're hoping will be similarly promising for them and for their future as a program. We talked about Auburn's recruiting class and kind of the disappointment that some of the fans felt around it, the lower than expected finish that they had, at least for that program standards. But they've added a couple of pretty impressive names since we last talked about Auburn's class. One of those guys being Drayshawn Miller from West Virginia, a transfer, and another guy who had originally signed with Tennessee but was released from his letter of intent, Dylan Brooks, who was one of the higher-rated prospects in the state of Alabama and has now signed with Auburn, immediately making him the highest-rated prospect in Auburn's recruiting class. So just taking a look at those two additions, and obviously they're guys coming out of high school. There's only so much you can know about them. But John, what do these late additions kind of do to our overall feelings about this Auburn signing class and the year that Auburn is heading towards under their brand new head coach?
Yeah, I mean, we were just talking about it before we started the show, and I had to kind of double check just to make sure the math was right. But I mean, they jumped 10 spots in the recruiting rankings because of adding, Dylan Brooks, which shows to you just the caliber of player he is. I think the fact that there was a bit of a prolonged battle for him to get his release, and the fact, that Tennessee specifically basically said they didn't want him going to an ACC school, I think shows how much Tennessee, didn't want to lose him, and certainly didn't want to lose him to another school in the SEC. So I think it's a notable addition, for Auburn. It kind of worked out well for them that Tennessee made a coaching change after the early signing period, and Dylan Brooks, wanted to get out of that and ultimately go to Auburn. So I think it helps, shore up what was, I think, in some ways a disappointing initial recruiting class for Brian Harsin. Everybody knows the first recruiting class is not going to be great because of how late you get in. And that's exactly how it played out. So adding somebody like Brooks, I think, is a good step. And I think hopefully, can maybe get them some momentum going forward. And they're going to have to sign more kids like Brooks. This can't be an exception. This has to basically be the rule of the type of caliber player that they're going to recruit if they want to compete at the highest levels of the SEC.
So Matt, we didn't really dig that much into the Auburn recruiting class. We've talked about it on some other shows that our AL.com crew has done. But just from your research and from what you've been able to glean about this 2021 signing class for Auburn, Dylan Brooks is a big name. They didn't have a lot of big names. Are there any names on that list that the Auburn coaching staff feels particularly good about, or that you think could sort of surprise us and maybe make an early impact?
I mean, he's not necessarily a member of the signing class, but I would say Drayshawn Miller, the corner who you just talked about, who's transferring in from West Virginia, somebody who's in position now to make an immediate impact. So you look at West Virginia, they were the number one ranked pass defense in the country. He was a starting cornerback for that West Virginia defense. So he's somebody definitely to keep an eye on, even if he doesn't necessarily fall in the category of being a member of the signing class. But I think, especially when you factor in some of the the players that Auburn lost from last year's team, that there are going to be a lot of guys, whether it's newcomers or players that didn't start last year, that are going to be stepping into bigger roles that are going to be very much factors this year. And I obviously throw out a few names as far as guys who are currently on the roster who I kind of have my eye on as potential candidates to take a step forward and play bigger roles. So I'll go offense, defense, special teams. Offensively, we saw one of the members of last year's receiver class start to take a step forward in the bowl game in Elijah Cannon. So I think it only played in one game last year prior to the bowl game, and then broke out some during the course of that last game of the season where he had 3 catches, his first career touchdown. He's definitely a candidate take a step forward this year, especially when you look at the fact that Auburn lost its top 3 receivers from last year's team. To go along with that, defensively, Ladarius Tennyson, you saw some of him the end of the year, especially when Christian Tutt was banged up. There's some optimism about him moving forward and his capability to break out some going into the season. And then one more name that I'll throw out as far as one that there's at least a little buzz about and people are optimistic about his upside for moving forward is Zion Puckett. So Zion was a 4-star recruit, and I'm not necessarily ready to say that I'm expecting him to break out in terms of defense next year, but he's somebody to keep an eye on as far as special teams and a guy who could potentially carve out a role there going into next season.
Yeah, and it's going to be, I mean, as we've often seen with coaching changes around the SEC, there can be some unexpected results on the field with guys that are already on the roster, as you mentioned, Matt, because just running a different system sometimes is going to benefit certain guys. I am curious though, like overall, when we look at this Auburn team, I mean, there's going to be some leeway that he's given in year one, but when you look at this roster, John, how do you feel Brian Harsin is positioned for this first year? If you're look, it's a big opportunity. Everybody understands why the guy would take this job to come from Boise State to Auburn. But just in terms of immediate success, is this a team that you feel like has components that you feel pretty good about in terms of being able to do that very difficult thing of having success in year one? I mean, you have to inherit some good luck. You have to inherit a roster that was sort of in just the right place to be able to have that instant success.
Yeah, I do think he inherited some good pieces. I mean, I think the thing that we're going to be saying, from now until next December, probably all the time, and so this is not going to be that original of a thought, but I think it's crucial, is first success in many ways could depend on Bo Nix's development. It's something that Gus Malzahn was very bullish about, and I think ultimately led to, in some ways, his downfall, that Bo did not develop the way he basically indicated he expected him to in year 2. Bo had some nice moments. He had some not so nice moments. There's been some very well documented struggles on the road, which, as everybody knows, is critical in the SEC. And I think next year, especially if we see more, full crowds, how does Bo handle, going to some of these difficult places? I think that's an important piece. So I think, if we see Brian Harsin win 8-9 games or something like that, or if it's more like 5-6, I think Bo is a big factor in that, because I think there are enough important pieces to Bo that indicate that he could be very successful, but there are enough concerns around Bo that can lead you to believe that he's maybe never going to develop into the guy that people expected when he came into Auburn as, a 5-star quarterback and very highly regarded and a state champion and someone who set all these records, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's, a very basic way of looking at things, but I can guarantee you that's going to be probably one of the biggest talking points heading into Auburn season and throughout the season, just what Bo's able to do.
No doubt. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, one of the biggest question marks and concerns with this team is exactly that, the passing game led by Bo Nix. But just looking at the state of the roster, this is a team that can be very competitive in the SEC because of what they have defensively and what they have in the backfield, a guy that we've talked a lot about in Tank Bigsby. But just to piggyback on what we were talking about in terms of the most recent addition in Drayshawn Miller, it adds to what was already a very good secondary for this team. And you can make a legitimate argument just looking at it on paper right now that this has a chance to be one of the better secondaries in the SEC, combining that with the fact that not only do you have some young promising players like Ladarius Tennison, but you have two players in Roger McCreary, Smoke Monday, who there was some thought that they could leave for the NFL draft. And essentially you do a good job as a staff recruiting them to stay. And especially when you look at Roger, that's a corner who had a chance to be a day 2 draft pick that now you get back on your team. And just overall defensively, you look at Zagumbi McClain was another one. It was one of the leading tacklers, if not the leading tackler in the SEC last year. Another guy who had a chance to go pro that comes back to school. You have the pieces there to be very good defensively. And then again, from an offensive standpoint, even though the passing game is definitely a question mark right now, you have one of the more talented young running backs in the country that you can lean on. I would expect them, just based on what they have on paper at this point, to be a competitive team going into next year.
Well, Matt, you talk about a couple of guys that could have left early for the draft. Let's get into some names from around the SEC that are entering the draft this year, that are draft eligible, and I think this is a very strange. Our strange year continues. Our year of trying to figure out how this is all going to work, despite these unprecedented conditions, continues. We've heard a lot of talk about how different the draft evaluation process is this year, not just because there's no combine this year, but because in a lot of cases, there's less film than people are used to. The whole decision-making process about who you draft is going to be different this year. So I want to get into some of these guys coming out of the SEC and what kind of careers we think they're going to have. And I'll start off with you, John. I mean, there's a bunch of obvious names. I mean, the first round is going to be loaded with SEC names most likely this year. Quite a few of those from Alabama, but Florida's going to have multiple guys most likely as well. Out of that group that are sort of surefire early round picks, are there any that stick out to you as having a particularly strong chance at success at the NFL level?
Yeah, I mean, to me, I think the guy who's the safest pick, probably from the SEC, is Patrick Surtain. He's someone who can probably go, I don't know, Xanos would probably know better than I do. I feel like maybe at the very high end, probably top 5, more likely, top 10, probably no later than top 15. I think everybody knows his dad had a very successful college and NFL career. I think just in terms of what you're looking for, I mean, he's like the ideal prototype, I think, of what the modern cornerback is at this point. I think he's going to be very steady. I mean, to me, he just seems like a guy who is going to play, at least 10 years in the NFL. Another one, not quite at that level. You'd probably be able to get him a little bit later, I think, in the first round. But J.C. Horn, who also has very good pedigree, being the son of Joe Horn. He's another one who I think will probably have a long NFL career. Two guys that I think you can feel good about. And I think and we'll get into this, I think, in the lead up to the NFL draft. There's a lot of great players of Alabama ties, but I think that Surtain overall is probably the safest of those picks. And I think in a year in which there's no combine, a lot of these guys either didn't play in the Senior Bowl or there wasn't as much Senior Bowl, I think, interactions. You are not having as many private pro days. You're having the team ones. Guys, as of right now, are not going to be able to make, all these different kind of trips where they can do private workouts for teams. So I think having safe picks will be more valued this year than ever. And that's why I really like Surtain.
Yeah, I think also, I mean, these, not to be totally dismissive of the process, but NFL front office guys do very much pride themselves on evaluating things in person with their own eyeballs instead of looking at film. So a lot of that's taken away too. But that said,
let me say this. I mean, I think, not to relate this all back to Nick Saban, but think about how Saban does things.
Yeah.
They watch film, but either, they haven't been able to do it during the pandemic, but they always want to get guys on campus. And talking to people who've known Saban over the years, one of the things he says is that you can watch film and know within 30 minutes whether a guy's good enough to play. And all the other time is determining whether he has the right mindset and mentality to play. And so I think that's not to, knock on your point here, but I think that's why
good point.
love getting face-to-face time is really kind of grilling them and getting the sense from the mental side of things.
You don't want to be
what it takes. And a perfect example is the Tennessee Titans offensive lineman Isaiah Wilson, who they spend a first-round draft pick on, and clearly just as of right now doesn't have either the work ethic or the mindset to want to compete. And that's, as of right now, looks like a blown pick. And on tape, he looked like a very good player.
For sure. You don't want to be finding yourself releasing a guy that you blew a first-round pick on in a few years. So, Matt, out of John talked about some of the high-round guys. Are there any sort of deeper cuts in this SEC draft class that you feel particularly good about in terms of having a long NFL career ahead of them?
Well, first of all, I'm surprised that John didn't give love to our guy, Kyle Pitts. So I'm going to give you a story that you'll like, Scalisi. So with Kyle Pitts, so not only is Kyle Pitts a tremendous player, obviously did some great things last year at Florida, but the funniest story that I have on Kyle Pitts, so this comes from his old tight ends coach at Florida, Larry Scott, who's now the head coach at Howard. Kyle Pitts is essentially a Spider-Man-like figure, a real-life Spider-Man-like figure. So if you look at him, I hate to say has kind of like the nerdy look, but he's a guy who wears glasses, you wouldn't necessarily think outside of him being 6'6" that this is some freakish top 10 draft pick just looking at him. But when he first got to Florida, was having problems with like his eyesight, and something that they became aware of early on. And just looking at him once again, he's a guy who walks around with glasses you wouldn't necessarily think is a star athlete. But he was at some freshman party, I want to say at Larry Scott's house, and got bit by some kind of bug. I don't know if it was a spider, something else, but was freaking out about it.
This feels like it's a rumor that
No, this is a real story. I'm being 100% serious. Guy got bit by some kind of bug. I don't know if they even knew what kind of bug it was. Freaked out, eventually got over it. Things progressively became less of an issue from an eyesight perspective, and also all of a sudden he becomes just this freakish superhuman-like figure for Florida. So I
also would just like to say, I just want to make one point here. I love that Matt is like an 80s meathead. That anybody he sees wearing glasses, automatically a nerd. That's just
like a nerd.
Yeah. Well, I'm not exactly comparing him
to Kyle Pitts
or somebody like that.
Kyle Pitts got bit by a motorcycle bug, and he now has the powers of a motorcycle in the body of a human.
So the question was, in terms of the non-first round guys, who are some that would bet on? So I'll throw out a couple. So one, speaking of guys that catch the football, Elijah Moore, I think has a lot of potential at the next level. Elijah, receiver from Ole Miss, who obviously there were some receivers, including Devontae Smith, that put up big-time numbers this year, but there was nobody on a national level that, if you look at the averages on a weekly basis, put up bigger numbers in terms of catches per game and receiving yards per game than Elijah Moore, ranked number one nationally in terms of both categories, averaged 10 catches per game and close to 150 receiving yards per game. Dynamic player that has a chance to go at some point in the first 3 rounds of the draft. Another receiver to go along with that, Terrace Marshall from LSU, I think has a lot of potential. If you combine the last 3 games of last year with the first 4 games of this year, before LSU started having quarterback issues, he had 14 receiving touchdowns in those 7 combined games dating back to the end of last year. That's pretty impressive. And then one guy from a defensive standpoint who is under the radar, and I don't know if I would necessarily bet on him to be like a perennial Pro Bowler or anything like that, but somebody who I think is a better pro prospect than maybe the general public knows, is linebacker from Kentucky, Jamin Davis. So ranked 3rd in the SEC in tackles, despite missing at least the Alabama game. I can't remember if he missed more than that, but missed at least 1 game, still ranked 3rd in the conference in tackles, and then tied for 1st among non-DBs in interceptions also with 3. And then just to add one more to that, so I know probably most people weren't paying a ton of attention to Vanderbilt this year, and obviously far from the best season for Vanderbilt as a program, but you have a defensive end from this year's Vanderbilt team who I know NFL people feel like has a lot of potential for that level in Dayo Odengbo, who I think finished with 5.5 sacks this year. He was the best player on a bad team, but somebody who people at the next level feel like has a chance to be a player at the NFL level, and actually closed the year, even though it was in a 41-0 loss for Vanderbilt, finished the year with a standout performance where he had a couple sacks against a Missouri team that obviously did some good things this year.
Well, an interesting group, and I do think it's an interesting milestone to look forward to this draft. Last year, the draft felt like it was the first sort of sports thing that happened that we could all watch and enjoy after everything totally shut down. And obviously, it was a very different experience than what we're used to in the draft. Hopefully, as we get closer to it, we'll see more. But hopefully, it will feel a little bit more like a traditional draft experience this year. We'll have to wait and see. It will still be a little bit different, but that was sort of, for me in 2020, one of the rare early sports bright spots was the draft last year. And I do think they ended up doing some things well with how they handled that draft that I'd kind of like to see them do going forward. I don't know. How did you guys end up feeling about how it was handled a year ago?
Well, the thing I'm most curious about, hey, how much more of a fan of Kyle Pitts are you now, Scalisi, just knowing the background of that story? I'm telling you, with the eyesight stuff, it was leading to him.
It's pretty amazing.
And you know what I heard about one of the other guys that Zenitz talked about? I heard that Elijah Moore got bit by a dog, and that's how he got his superpower.
Someone held up a play card with a picture of a fire hydrant on it at the Egg Bowl, and he couldn't help himself.
He's come a long way from that, though.
He has, for sure. That unfortunately, that clip is probably going to be shown many, many times for the rest of his career. But he's put a lot of other clips up in the meantime against some really good teams.
Where do you think he's projected to go? To me, he's a guy who you'd love to get. Like, if you get him in the 3rd or 4th round, you'd be happy about it.
Yeah. I think he probably goes at some point in the 2nd or 3rd round, if I had to guess. But that's just kind of a guess right now based on some of the early feedback that I've gotten. I would say the safe bet for him in terms of over-under would be 3rd round.
And one name I want to ask you guys about before we wrap up today, because there's been some discussion about it in the past couple of weeks. I mean, you see Mac Jones mentioned kind of in wildly varying spots when people talk about the draft. In terms of his future career, is there a spot that either of you kind of see for him right now? Because look, he obviously there are strengths he has to his game. There are also weaknesses. Is there a spot that you feel like would set him up for success particularly well in terms of landing with a particular team or two?
Patriots or Saints?
Who'd you say?
Patriots or Saints?
So I was going to say exactly that. I think those are the two that make the most sense. And I heard Mina Kimes at ESPN was talking about the Saints. I think the Saints makes a lot of sense. Sean Payton's done a great job. Maybe they keep Jameis for a year and they let him train. But I think, I think Mac is one of those guys that where he lands with will be so critical to his level of success going forward. I think you could drop Trevor Lawrence on pretty much any team and he's going to be pretty successful. I think Mac, the fit matters a lot more, specifically, the style of play and all those kind of things. But I think I totally agree with Zenitz. I think those are the two picks that come the most to mind for me.
I just don't know if he makes it to them. There's obviously talk at this point, early talk, that he could be gone before either of those teams pick. So,
there's always the chance one of those guys trades up. It's particularly New England, just because I think they're usually averse to doing that, but they're, they seem like they're in need of a quarterback currently. So who knows? Who knows how that'll work out for Mac?
I think somebody's going to fall in love with Mac, honestly. I think he's a great competitor. He's a great kid. I think, Saban, will give him a very strong endorsement, which is, I think, probably why some people have tied him to the Patriots because of, his relationship with Belichick. But I think that some team, probably in the top 15 or so, is going to really fall in love once they get a chance to really work with him and whether that's trading up or what, but make a move to get him.
All right. Well, we will keep you guys updated on all the developments regarding the NFL draft and how it impacts players from the SEC. We'll also keep you guys posted on any other breaking news that happens here on First Down South next week. I will be out next week, but these two gentlemen will be back for another episode. And thanks everybody for joining us. You can find more of the excellent work from Matt Zenitz and John Talty over at AL.com.